Hello everyone, welcome back. Today we're going to be talking about Chapter 12, Negative Reinforcement. This is from the Cooper, Huron, and Heward textbook, the 3rd edition. There are two 6th edition BCABA TCO items that will be covered within this lecture, and they'll be coming from the Behavior Change Procedures section of the TCO list. More specifically, the TCOs that we will be covering are G1 and G2. G1 specifically says that you will learn to develop and implement positive and negative reinforcement procedures, including contingent and non-contingent applications. And then G2 says that you will develop and implement procedures to establish and use conditioned reinforcers. Alrighty, so let's jump into talking about the topic of negative reinforcement. And we'll start off with a technical definition of negative reinforcement. Negative reinforcement is the removal of a stimulus contingent on behavior that results in an increase in the future probability of behavior. So I'll break that down for you guys. So we've talked about reinforcement, and reinforcement is the principle in which we increase behavior based off of the consequence that follows behavior. So whatever consequences following behavior should result in an increase in the future probability of that behavior. And I've also mentioned to you guys that when you hear the terms positive and negative, you shouldn't think of the words good or bad, right? When you hear the terms positive and negative within the context of ABA, you should be thinking of the addition of something. For when you hear the term positive, you should think of the addition of some stimulus after behavior. And when you hear the term negative, you should be thinking of the removal of some stimulus following behavior. Okay, so that, when you can remember that, I think of it like as a mathematical formula. When you can remember these terms in that way, you'll never forget what negative reinforcement is, what negative punishment is, or what positive reinforcement or positive punishment are. You kind of have to break the term down, and then that'll help you remember what each term is. Okay, so again, negative reinforcement is when some stimulus is removed following behavior, and that stimulus change is going to produce an increase in the future probability of behavior. So let's explore what the contingency looks like for negative reinforcement. And if you recall, for our during our lecture for positive reinforcement, I mentioned that reinforcement is dependent largely on our motivating operation. So there has to be some establishing operation specifically present in order for you to engage in behavior in order to gain access to a reinforcer. And what I mean by reinforcement is dependent largely on a motivating operation. I'm trying to say that if you're not motivated for something, you're not going to engage in behavior in order to gain access to that item, right? If I'm not motivated for food, even if there is food, I'm not going to consume the food, because why would I seek out food if I'm not hungry, right? Unless I'm thinking about the future and about how I might be hungry in the future, and so then I'll go and I'll seek out food. But the main point that I'm trying to drive here is that we need to be motivated in order for us to engage in behavior in order to gain access or to remove some sort of stimulus in order for our behavior to be increased in the future. So let's break down what this looks like. I think the breakdown will be a lot easier. Okay. So with negative reinforcement is when we engage in behaviors in order to terminate or avoid some sort of aversive stimulus. So there has to be some aversive stimulus that's present in our environment, or that we've been exposed to previously, that we either engage in behavior to remove that stimulus, or we engage in behavior to avoid even being present or having to experience that stimulus. Okay, so we're going to have the same 4-term contingency. You're still going to have the EO, right? This is what I mean when I'm talking about the 4-term contingency, this whole thing here, right? This is our 4-term contingency. We have the EO, so this is our establishing operation. This is some environmental variable that's going to increase the value of some reinforcer, and we're going to engage in behavior in order to gain access to that reinforcer, okay? So in this particular case, when we're talking about negative reinforcement, there's some aversive stimulus that's present in our environment. So if we look here, In this example, we have loud noise from a construction outside. So the loud noise is an aversive stimulus, and this serves as an establishing operation in order for us to seek out a reinforcer, right? And that reinforcer is the alleviation of that aversive stimulus, right? We don't want to be in the presence of that aversive stimulus anymore, so we're going to engage in behavior in order to no longer have to be in the presence of that stimulus. So we have our establishing operation, which establishes no noise as a reinforcer. Okay. And so then we're going to engage in behavior in order to gain access to that reinforcer. So we need to have a discriminative stimulus, so our SD. So our SD is that there's a roommate nearby. So you hear loud noise, that's the aversive stimulus, and then there's a roommate nearby, which signals that we can engage in behavior in order to get access to our reinforcer. So we ask our roommate to close the window. That's the behavior. And what happens is the noise is removed. I don't have to hear this annoying noise anymore. So the noise was removed, meaning there was a removal of this aversive stimulus that was present to begin with. Okay. So what's going to happen in the future? In the future, when I hear an annoying noise, right, we have this annoying noise over here, I'm going to engage in this behavior, in order to get the noise removed. So that noise now goes away. In the future, now I'm more likely to engage in this behavior of that's going to result in the removal of the noise. Okay. So this is our negative reinforcement. This is an example of escape. We are escaping an aversive stimulus by engaging in this particular behavior. And what maintains our behavior? It's the removal of the stimulus contingent on engaging in behavior. So I hope that it's clear, but if it's not, then I have a few other examples in the next few slides where I'll go over these contingencies. I also am going to be helping you guys discriminate between escape contingencies and avoidance contingencies, because those are distinct, right? Those are they're very similar, but they are different concepts. So you need to understand and just be able to discriminate between avoidance and escape maintained behaviors. All right, so let's jump into our discussion on escape maintained behaviors and avoidance maintained behaviors. These are two very similar, there's two very similar contingencies for each of these, but they are different, like I mentioned. With escape maintained behaviors, the individual needs to be experiencing that aversive contingency already, and then they engage in behavior to avoid the aversive contingency. So in this example, we have a girl that's walking in the rain, or a woman that's walking, and it starts to rain, let's say. She approaches a store. She sees a store where they sell umbrellas, and she buys an umbrella and uses her new umbrella. This results in the removal of this aversive stimulus. So she no longer needs to experience that rain falling on her clothes because she purchased the umbrella. So what's going to happen is in the future, her behavior of purchasing an umbrella or using an umbrella is going to increase, because using an umbrella reduces or completely eliminates that aversive stimulation that she was experiencing. Okay, so this is a form of escape maintained behavior, again, because she was experiencing the aversive condition, and then that aversive condition was removed following behavior. So she no longer needs to be getting wet on her clothes. She's no longer getting raindrops on her clothes following the behavior that she engaged in. So in the future, that behavior of purchasing umbrellas or using an umbrella is going to increase. Okay. Similarly, there's an example that teachers and parents experience very often. And they're like, I don't know why my child engages in problem behavior when I present them with work. Well, it's possible that if you're presenting work and the child is engaging in problem behavior following the presentation of work, and what results is that work is removed, well, then they're learning that by engaging in problem behavior, my work is going to be removed. And so in the future, I'm just going to engage in problem behavior so I don't have to be present, so I don't have to experience that aversive contingency or that aversive condition. So they learn to engage in problem behavior in order for work to be removed. So this is something that we experience pretty often, where a child will learn that in order to not have to complete work or to have work removed, they just engage in problem behavior and then they maybe get sent to timeout. Or they engage in problem behavior and the parent or the teacher is like, okay, you don't have to do it right now. So that's a form of negative reinforcement. A stimulus is being removed, right? The work is being removed following that behavior, that whatever the problem behavior is. It could be aggression, it could be throwing of the homework, it could be ripping up the homework, whatever it might be. But they learn that by engaging in this problem behavior, the work is going to be removed, that aversive stimulus is going to be removed. And so in the future, the problem behavior goes up. So the escape is maintaining that problem behavior. Just like in this example, the escape from this aversive condition, escape from getting wet, is gonna maintain that behavior of purchasing an umbrella in the future or using an umbrella in the future. So when coming up with examples to show you guys, I made sure to include examples of appropriate or desirable escape maintained behaviors. So this example up here, this is a good appropriate behavior for individuals to engage in, right? If someone is experiencing an aversive condition such as getting wet in the rain, then it's great for them to learn to either purchase an umbrella or use an umbrella in order to avoid or escape that condition, right? This is an excellent example of negative reinforcement, and we experience these types of contingencies in our life all the time. We engage in behaviors maintained by negative reinforcement all the time, appropriate behaviors, right? But then there are maladaptive behaviors, like I gave you guys in this example down here. This is a form of maladaptive behavior that is maintained by negative reinforcement. So we want to be aware of the fact that negative reinforcement or escape, right? Escape maintained behaviors can be appropriate behaviors, and there can also be maladaptive forms of these behaviors. So when you are working with a client, if you're working with a client that's presenting maladaptive behaviors maintained by escape or maintained by negative reinforcement, you want to consider if there are alternative forms of escape or of alternative behaviors, essentially, that they can be taught that can replace this behavior. So, for example, instead of engaging in ripping up the homework or throwing of the homework or whatever it is, aggression that maybe is occurring when you're presented with homework, can they be taught to work for a little bit, maybe just 30 seconds, just work for 30 seconds, and then we'll teach them to request a break? Can they be taught to request a break instead of engaging in this maladaptive behavior? That might be something that you would consider doing instead. Some people traditionally have taught something that we call escape extinction. Escape extinction would look if you guys recall, extinction is when you withhold reinforcement. So if in this particular case reinforcement is not having to complete the task, well, withholding reinforcement in this case would look like would be withholding escape. So that's what escape extinction is. So some people might see this contingency and say, oh, this is escape maintained problem behavior. We need to implement escape extinction and not allow them to escape the task. We need to make sure that they complete the task. That would be what escape extinction would look like in this case. But really, yes, that is something that we can consider implementing. But I would urge you guys to see if there's an alternative behavior also that can be taught. Escape extinction, there's a time and a place for it. I wouldn't say it should be your go-to intervention for escape maintained behaviors. There's going to be times when it's necessary, but extinction has a lot of behaviors that come along with it, a lot of negative behaviors. We have our extinction-induced aggression. We have our extinction burst, where we'll see higher intensity problem behavior, higher magnitude problem behavior, higher frequency problem behavior. We'll see different topographies of problem behavior. So I really urge you guys to consider whether or not escape extinction is an appropriate intervention for the client that you're working with. Usually there's other interventions that we can combine or that we can use instead of escape extinction, such as maybe teaching an appropriate alternative behavior. That would be a good possible intervention that you can use. And this is just my little ethical tidbit that I'd like to throw into my lectures that I've mentioned to you guys. Let's jump into talking about avoidance maintained behaviors now. Avoidance maintained behaviors are behaviors that we engage in order to avoid experiencing an aversive stimulus. So notice here how I'm talking about avoiding experiencing an aversive stimulus. This means that with avoidance maintained behaviors, that individual is not experiencing that aversive stimulus at all. So in the previous slide, the escape maintained behaviors that I showed you guys, those two examples, both of those individuals were experiencing the aversive stimulus. So in the first example, the person was already getting rained on. And in the second example, the person was put in a situation where they had the homework in front of them already. So avoidance behaviors are when we are not experiencing that aversive stimulus yet. So in anticipation of experiencing that aversive stimulus, we engage in behavior to avoid even experiencing that aversive stimulus. So in the example of the boy with the homework, I gave you guys the example where the boy was already in the presence of the homework and he engages in behavior to take away that homework, basically. So he maybe throws the homework and then now he doesn't have to do his homework anymore. Well, if we were to look at that contingency in terms of avoidance, that would look like a teacher maybe saying, okay, guys, now we're going to go to the table. And when the teacher says we're going to go to the table, that signals to that individual that a worsening condition is coming, right? It signals to them that I'm going to have to go to the table and do work. And so that child is now going to engage in problem behavior at that point without even being in the presence of the homework. They're going to engage in problem behavior. And then the teacher's like, okay, go to timeout. And so then the child completely avoids having to do homework. Right? The teacher might think timeout, quote unquote, timeout is a punisher, but in this particular case, it might serve as a reinforcer, as a negative reinforcer, because the removal of the aversive condition is what's maintaining that behavior. Okay, so in the future, their problem behavior of maybe what was it that I said? I don't know if it was like engaging in a tantrum. That problem behavior is going to increase in the future. So let's look at some of these examples that I have on this slide here for you. So let's look at the first example, and I'm going to give you guys some context to better understand the first example, because I mentioned to you guys that for avoidance behaviors, there's usually like some learning history that's involved, or some learning, some previous contingencies that the person has been exposed to that really influence the behavior that they're going to engage in. With avoidance behavior, these are behaviors that we engage in anticipation of being exposed to some aversive stimulus. So we want to avoid experiencing that aversive stimulus at all. So let's say that for the first example, there's this person in the blue has an ex-partner that is very toxic, that when she's been in the presence of this ex-partner, they have yelled at her, maybe they've called her names, and so she really wants to avoid, ever being in the same room as that person again. But let's say that her friend Susie is still friends with the ex-partner. Maybe they were childhood friends, and so Susie and the ex-partner continue to talk and hang out from time to time. So let's say Susie receives a text message that the ex-partner is going to come over. So this is a signal for this person, for the person in the blue, let's call her Jill, for Jill to engage in behavior in order to leave that area or leave Susie's house, so that she doesn't have to come into contact with the ex-partner anymore. So Jill is going to leave Susie's house, and what's going to happen is she doesn't have to come into contact with that aversive partner anymore, with that ex-partner that used to maybe call her names. So she does not have to experience that. So in the future, if she hears that ex-partner is coming over again, she's going to engage in behavior to leave the area so that she doesn't have to have her peace disturbed. That's what we can call it. So in this case, the avoidance behavior is the leaving of the apartment or the house, the friend's house, so that she no longer, or so that she does not have to even come into contact with that ex-partner. So if you notice in this particular example, Jill never comes into contact with the ex-partner, but continues to engage in this behavior of leaving in the future when she hears that he's going to be in the same place as her. So some of you guys might relate to this. If you do relate to this, this is a form of avoidance maintained behavior that you're engaging in. And it's a type of negative reinforcement. You don't want to come into contact with that aversive stimulus. And so we continue to engage in that behavior in the future that permits us to not have to experience that aversive stimulus. Another example of this is, let's say that you are a bike rider and that you see clouds in the sky. The clouds in the sky are an SD that are going to tell you, a worsening condition is coming or is approaching. And so as a biker, you might decide to hang out, like drive to an overpass and stay under the bridge to avoid getting rained on. Once the rain is gone, then you drive home peacefully. But the key here is that you never had to come into contact with getting rained on, because you have learned from your previous experience that maybe hanging out at the overpass or under the overpass is gonna help you avoid that stimulus, that aversive stimulus. Okay, so just to kind of reiterate the points that I've made across the last few slides, escape and avoidance are very similar. They're both forms of negative reinforcement, but with escape maintained behaviors, you need to be in the presence of the aversive stimulus, and then you engage in behavior in order to remove that aversive stimulus. Whereas with avoidance, there's some form of signal in the environment that's going to tell you, hey, some form of worsening condition is coming, so you should engage in behavior in order to avoid that particular stimulus. The environment behavior relationship in escape contingencies are very clearly identifiable. All this means is that with escape maintained behaviors, it's very easy to pinpoint what that establishing operation is, right? It's very easy to pinpoint what that aversive stimulus that is evoking our behavior is, or making our behavior more likely to occur is. Whereas with avoidance behaviors, the evocative and the maintaining influences involved are less easy to identify. So in the example of the ex-partner that is toxic, it's very easy to pinpoint why you're avoiding that particular person. But there are going to be situations in our life where it's very difficult to identify why we even engage in avoidance behaviors in the presence to avoid particular stimuli. So with escape contingencies, it's very, very easy to identify that EO, whereas with avoidance contingencies, it can be a little bit harder. All right, so now let's look at a different example and let's talk about why it's negative reinforcement. So let's say that you have a headache and you see medicine and you're like, okay, I'm going to take medicine to take away my headache. So you take medicine and what happens is your headache goes away. Well, this is an example of negative reinforcement because the headache is being removed. So, right, if we look at the aversive stimulus that was present, or our EO, there was a person that had a headache. That's the aversive stimulus. And after taking the medicine, after our behavior, the headache is removed. Okay. People ask me all the time, yeah, but a pill was added, medication was added. And I always tell them that's the behavior that they engaged in. The behavior was taking the medication. Taking the medication was not a stimulus. That's the behavior that we're increasing. Okay? Taking medication is only going to be reinforcing if the aversive stimulus is removed. Okay? So if you take medication, and your headache is still there, guess what? Your behavior is not gonna be reinforced. This behavior of taking medication is not gonna go up in the future if your headache still remains after taking medicine. So I'll give you guys a personal example. I suffer from migraines. And as a person that suffers from migraines, when I take Tylenol, the Tylenol does not take my headache away. So guess what? Do you think I'm going to continue engaging in that behavior in the future? No, because my aversive stimulus, the aversive stimulus that I was experiencing, the headache, was not removed after I took the medication. So it's the removal of the pain that's maintaining the behavior of continuing to take medication in the future. Only if taking the medication removes the pain am I going to continue to take medication in the future. So after going to the doctor and getting prescribed stronger medication, I now have medication that does work, that is effective at removing that aversive stimulus, that is effective at removing the pain. So I do take that prescribed medication, but I don't take Tylenol anymore. Why don't I take Tylenol anymore? I don't take Tylenol anymore because in the past, when I've taken Tylenol, Tylenol does not serve to get rid of that aversive stimulus. It doesn't help me to get rid of the pain. Instead, I do take the prescribed medication because the prescribed medication does function to reduce the headache that I experience or the migraine that I experience. Okay, so in this particular example, it's the removal of the pain that functions as a reinforcer for the taking the prescribed medication. And in the example of the Tylenol, taking Tylenol for me does not function as a reinforcer. It is not increasing my behavior of taking Tylenol because it's not removing the pain. Okay, so we always need to ask ourselves, what is happening following behavior? Is the aversive stimulus being removed? If the aversive stimulus is not being removed, we're not likely to continue engaging in that behavior. So we have to consider, what is the stimulus change that is maintaining our behavior, okay? Like I said, I have students that find it confusing because they're saying, oh, but we're taking medication. It's not the taking of the medication that's going to maintain my behavior. In the example of the Tylenol, I am taking medication, right? I do take a pill, but guess what? That pill, if it doesn't have the effect of removing the headache, I'm no longer going to continue to engage in that behavior. So it's the removal of the pain that's maintaining that behavior in the future. Okay, so I hope that this helps to kind of help you guys navigate through deciding whether an example that you're seeing is negative reinforcement or not. I came up with some examples of different different contingencies, and I want you guys to decide on whether these are escape maintained behaviors or avoidance maintained behaviors. So example number 1, you need to get home. So you get in the car and your seatbelt alarm is going off. You put on your seatbelt. What happens after you put on your seatbelt? The alarm goes away. What do you guys think? Is this escape or is this avoidance? I'll wait a few seconds. You guys can pause your videos and you can try to answer this question or this example. All right, so hopefully you've thought about an answer to this. This is an example of escape maintained behavior. Because you are already experiencing that aversive stimulus, so you are already hearing that annoying seatbelt alarm, and so you decide to put your seatbelt on. So in the future, putting your seatbelt on is going to increase because of the removal of that aversive stimulus, the seatbelt alarm. For some people, the seatbelt alarm, they've already habituated to it, so it's not an aversive stimulus to them. And it's important to keep in mind that not all stimuli or stimuli will be aversive to some people, and to other people it won't be aversive. So for me in particular, seatbelt alarms are very aversive. I don't like going into a car and hearing the seatbelt alarm, so I do engage in that in the behavior of putting my seatbelt on just to not hear the alarm. Whereas my partner, for example, he's habituated to the sounds. He gets into the car, he hears the seatbelt alarm, and it doesn't bother him. It's just like another stimulus in the environment. To him, it almost serves as a neutral stimulus because it doesn't affect his behavior in any way. And so, and you have to consider whether there is an aversive stimulus that's present or not. So for some people, it will be an aversive stimulus. For other people, it won't. In my case, and in this example, it is an aversive stimulus that we then engage in behavior to remove. And it's that removal of the stimulus following behavior that's going to maintain the behavior over time. Okay, let's look at the next example. Okay, so the next example is you got home and were sniffling. So you drink vitamin C and allergy meds in order to feel better. Let's say that you do start to feel better after drinking your vitamin C and your allergy meds. Well, what is this an example of? So pause your video and tell me what, or you guys can out loud say what you think this is an example of. Is this escape maintained behavior or avoidance? All right, so this is an example of an escape maintained behavior. Again, you were experiencing the aversive contingency already, the aversive condition already. So you were already sniffling, and so you consume the medication and you consume the vitamin C, and what happens is that aversive stimulus is removed, so you're no longer sniffling. So in the future, your behavior is going to increase because taking medication has proven to reduce the sniffling. Let's look at the next example. You see parking signs to pay for parking. So you pay for parking and your car is still there with no ticket displayed. So what is this an example of? Is this escape maintained behavior or avoidance? All right, so if you guessed avoidance, you are correct. And it's avoidance because you are not experiencing the aversive stimulus, right? There is no parking ticket that you've been presented with yet. You're simply seeing a sign that's warning you of this aversive stimulus coming. And so you engage in behavior in order to avoid experiencing that, getting a ticket, or maybe to avoid getting your car towed. Okay, so this is an example of avoidance. Alrighty, so we are now looking at this example. You get called for an interview. You decide to research the company and you see bad reviews. So you ultimately decide that you don't want to continue with the job, and you reply to the recruiter that you will be pursuing other options so that you don't need to experience what you saw in the negative reviews. Take a second and decide, is this escape or avoidance? Okay, this is an example of avoidance. And again, it's avoidance because you haven't experienced the negative things that were mentioned in the reviews. You simply read about it and you're like, okay, this is enough for me to not want to continue with this job, just so that I don't have to experience those aversive stimuli or aversive conditions that were mentioned in the reviews. So you don't ever experience the aversive conditions. You simply read about them and you were like, this is enough for me. I don't want to experience that. So you avoid pursuing that option. Let's look at the next example. You walk outside and it's very bright, so you put on your glasses to block the sun. What is this an example of? Escape or avoidance? Alrighty, so if you guessed escape, you are correct. This is a form of escape because you were already experiencing the aversive stimulus. So in this particular example, you already are outside where it is very bright. So it's very bright, you put on your glasses, and that aversive stimulus is removed. It's no longer very bright. The brightness is at a tolerable level now. So that's a form of escape maintained behaviors. What about this other behavior? I personally engage in this behavior. You're going to the beach, so you put on sunscreen and you don't get sunburnt. Is this escape or is this avoidance? This is an example of avoidance, all right? You are avoiding getting a sunburn by putting on sunscreen. So in the future, you are more likely to put on sunscreen because you didn't get sunburnt. Okay. If let's say that you purchase a sunscreen that is not effective, right? Let's say you purchase a sunscreen and you still get and you put on the sunscreen and you still get sunburnt. That sunscreen that is not effective, you are not going to continue to use that sunscreen. What maintains our behavior is the fact that it was effective at removing that aversive stimulus, or at avoiding that aversive stimulus. So because the sunscreen is effective at preventing a sunburn, that's why we continue to use that sunscreen in the future. For people that use aloe vera following a sunburn, this is not an example that I have on here, but I just thought of it right now. There's people that they get sunburnt, right? They get a sunburn and then they apply aloe vera, which helps alleviate the feeling of the sunburn. What is that an example of? Is that escape or is that avoidance? All right, I'm going to tell you guys, that's an example of avoidance. I'm sorry, of escape. Putting on the sunscreen is an example of avoidance. Putting on the aloe vera is an example of escape, because they have already gotten sunburnt. They're already experiencing that aversive stimulus. Then putting on the aloe vera alleviates that. And so that is a form of escape. Okay, so they have to no longer experience that feeling of being sunburnt. Of course, over time, that feeling returns. And so then they'll again apply the aloe vera, because it provides like some momentary alleviation of that painful stimulus. Let's look at our next example. Your phone is ringing at 7 p.m. and you see that it's your boss. So you don't answer. And what happens is you don't get called into work or reprimanded. So in this particular example, there's some form of learning history. Maybe in the past, you've learned that if you answer the phone, your boss is going to ask you to come into work. Or it might be that your boss calls you to reprimand you for something. So what is this an example of? Your phone is ringing at 7 p.m. You see it's your boss. You don't answer. And so you don't get called into work or you don't get reprimanded. What do you guys think? Is it escape or avoidance? All right. Hopefully by this point, you are getting some more of the answers right. This is an example of avoidance. You're avoiding getting called into work and you're avoiding getting reprimanded. Because maybe in the past, like I said, you've experienced answering the phone and either getting reprimanded or answering the phone. Getting reprimanded or getting called into work. And so you've learned that I'm just not going to answer the phone outside of business hours because I don't want to experience these aversive stimulus, at this time. Let's look at the next example. Boring work meeting, so you take a bathroom break. What is that? Escape or avoidance? Right, this one is an example of escape. You're already experiencing that boring aversive stimulus, right? And so you're like, okay, I need to take a break from this. You go to the bathroom and it provides some relief from that aversive stimulus. So it is a form of escape. All right, the next one is our fire alarm is sounding. So you take your towel and you blow air over it, and then the fire alarm stops ringing. What do you guys think, escape or avoidance? Okay, if you answered escape, you are correct. You were already experiencing the aversive stimulus, the very loud fire alarm noise. So you engage in behavior to you engage in behavior to escape that particular stimulus. So by blowing over the fire alarm with a towel, you are able to remove that stimulus. And so we continue to engage in that behavior in the future when we hear a fire alarm. This actually happens to me very often in my house. Our fire alarm goes off, and so I blow over it with a towel, and it takes it away. Okay, so in the previous slide, I covered a lot of different examples of escape and avoidance behaviors. I really hope that by this point, you already feel more comfortable with discriminating between escape and avoidance behaviors. If not, please go back and review those examples in the previous slide just to kind of help you distinguish between those two. So now we're going to talk about socially versus automatic negative reinforcement. In some of the examples that I've given you guys, I've provided examples of social negative reinforcement, or automatic negative reinforcement. So the difference between these is really whether the reinforcer is being delivered through somebody else, or whether we are engaging in behavior to gain access to that reinforcer ourselves. Okay, so in the example that I gave you guys, I think I gave the example to you guys, but I included it on here anyways, where there's a loud noise from a construction outside. And so we see that our roommate is close by, and we ask our roommate to close the window for us. And what happens is the noise goes away. Well, in this particular example, this is a form of socially maintained negative reinforcement, or social negative reinforcement, I'm sorry, where the roommate is the one that's providing us with access to that reinforcer. So it's the roommate that is engaging in the behavior in order to provide us with that reinforcer that we're seeking out. Whereas in the example of you putting sunblock on yourself, that's a form of automatic negative reinforcement. So I'm putting sunblock on myself in order to avoid experiencing the sensation of a sunburn. Or in this particular example that I gave you guys right here, I could walk over and I can close the window myself in order to have that noise removed. That is also an example of automatic negative reinforcement. Okay. If you're a parent and you are applying the sunscreen to your child, that is not an example of automatic negative reinforcement. That's an example of social negative reinforcement. Because you are the one that's controlling the reinforcer for that for your child, basically. So we have some examples of social negative reinforcement in our own lives, and we have some examples of automatic negative reinforcement in our own lives. So now that you've learned about negative reinforcement, the definition, you've learned about escape and avoidance and learned to distinguish between escape and avoidance contingencies, I want to, continue to break down the concept of negative reinforcement. So those behaviors that we engage in that result in escape or avoidance, those behaviors can serve different purposes. These behaviors can be, adaptive behaviors, meaning that they're behaviors that improve our everyday lives in some way. They allow us to more effectively communicate our needs, or they allow us to learn new self-care skills or social skills, etc. Or they can be maladaptive behaviors, meaning that they're not necessarily improving our life in any way, but rather that they are, we are escaping some aversive contingency or avoiding some aversive contingency, but really these are maladaptive forms of behavior. They're problematic behaviors in some way. They might be harmful to that person's life, etc. So I'll give examples of each of these. So some examples of socially appropriate behaviors that are adaptive and would be negatively reinforced would be, for example, when you get a phone call, right, and you see that it says scam likely, or it says like telemarketer, there are different things that you can do. You can either answer the phone, okay, you can ignore the phone, or you could hang up the call. Let's say that you were to hang up the phone call. That's an example of you engaging in, and then what ends up happening is the consequences that you avoid taking a scam call. That's an example of an adaptive behavior that's negatively reinforcing. Okay, it's a good behavior to engage in. It's, and we shouldn't say good, but it's a good skill to have. I would say it's a good social skill to have, to just know that you shouldn't take scam calls, or maybe answer telemarketer phone calls if you're not interested in talking to a telemarketer. So that's an example of a socially appropriate behavior that is negatively reinforced, right? The value of that behavior is that you're learning to avoid the contingency of taking a scam call, avoid the stimulus, that aversive stimulus of taking a scam call, speaking with a scammer over the phone. Another example would be, let's say that you arrive at a theme park and you see that there's a line that's going to take 2 hours. If you are standing in front of the line and you're contemplating, well, do I go in, do I not go in? and you decide not to go on that ride, instead you're going to go on another ride, that's an adaptive behavior. You have now avoided waiting in line for 2 hours, but it serves, like a purpose for that particular individual. There are maladaptive behaviors, though, that people engage in that are negatively reinforced, and we need to be able to distinguish as behavior analysts between these different types of behaviors. We will sometimes try to teach behaviors that are adaptive and serve like the purpose of escape or avoidance. So for example, let's say that you have a client that engages in aggression to escape some sort of interaction with a client, with someone else, with a peer, let's say. If you have a client that engages in aggression to escape interactions with peers, we could simply teach them appropriate mands, right? The aggression is considered a maladaptive form of behavior. It's a problem behavior, however you would like to look at it. It's not appropriate by any means. And so if we were working with that client, we could teach them an appropriate replacement behavior that is adaptive and that would serve the same function of negative reinforcement. And so in this particular case, you could teach the person to walk away. Walking away could be a behavior that would help them, avoid that aversive stimulus. Or you could teach them to request, escape. I don't want to, maybe if they're in a classroom, they could say, I don't want to be here right now, or I need a break. You could teach them to talk to another adult about something that happened. There are different behaviors that we could teach this individual that would allow them to access that same reinforcer, but in a more socially appropriate way. Okay, so it's important to know that, if you have a client that's engaging in a maladaptive behavior that is negatively reinforced, you should be thinking, is there some other form of socially appropriate behavior that I could teach that might serve the same function? And I think for the purpose of this slide, I also just wanted to distinguish that there are adaptive and maladaptive behaviors that can be negatively reinforced. To continue breaking down negative reinforcement, it's important that we understand the types of negative reinforcers that exist. We have our unconditioned negative reinforcers, and then we have our conditioned negative reinforcers. And this is going to be really similar to what you've learned before about unconditioned reinforcers and conditioned reinforcers, except here we're talking specifically about negative reinforcers. So anytime you hear the word unconditioned, we're referring to those unlearned reinforcers, those innate reinforcers, or items or activities that are naturally reinforcing. And then we also have our conditioned negative reinforcers, which are learned reinforcers, and these gain their reinforcing value through being paired with other reinforcers. So one key distinction that we typically need to make when we're talking about negative reinforcers is that we need to describe, when we are describing negative reinforcers, we need to specify the effect that those stimuli are having on behavior. It's not sufficient to just name the stimulus, the physical stimulus. Instead, we have to talk about the direction of the behavior. So shock, for example, you can't just say shock is a negative reinforcer, okay? Because shock can be a negative reinforcer, but it can also be a positive reinforcer. It could also be a punisher. It really depends on context. We need more information. So shock is an aversive stimulus that can serve as an establishing operation, and it could also serve as a punisher. Okay, so the removal of shock is what's going to function as a negative reinforcer. If we don't specify what's happening to the stimulus, then we're going to receive incomplete information. So anytime that you're talking about a negative reinforcer, you need to make sure that you're mentioning what exactly is happening to that stimulus. Okay, so now that I've specified that you need to make sure you're talking about what happens to the particular stimulus in order to appropriately describe negative reinforcers. Let's look at examples of unconditioned negative reinforcers and some conditioned negative reinforcers. So some examples of unconditioned negative reinforcers are the removal or avoidance of shock, the removal or avoidance of bright lights or of loud noise, extreme temperatures, etc. So any of those stimuli that are just innately have an effect on our behaviors, they can be unconditioned negative reinforcers if we remove those stimuli and then our behavior increases, right? So if the removal of those stimuli contingent on some behavior results in an increase in the future probability of that behavior, then that would be considered a negative reinforcer. Okay, and then we have our conditioned negative reinforcers, which, as I mentioned, they obtain their negative reinforcement value through pairing with other stimuli. Examples would be removal or avoidance of parental nagging, or of a parking ticket, a reprimand, a difficult task, an annoying sibling. These are different stimuli that were not aversive stimuli to begin with, but they gained their, as I mentioned, their aversive value, or I don't know if that's the correct way to say it. They became aversive through pairing, over time. I want to touch really quickly on the difference between negative reinforcement and punishment, because some students tend to get confused between these different types of principles. And I want to emphasize that with reinforcement behavior, the future frequency of behavior will always be increasing, and with punishment, the future frequency of behavior will always be decreasing. I think people get confused between negative reinforcement and punishment because of the role of the aversive stimulus in negative reinforcement, and the role of aversive stimuli in punishment. You just need to know that the aversive stimuli in negative reinforcement are going to be present prior to the behavior occurring, and that the behavior is going to be terminated. The aversive stimulus is going to be terminated following the behavior. And then within punishment, the aversive stimulus typically is part of the consequence. That will help you. Hopefully this slide will help you to distinguish between those. And again, just remember, punishment is a procedure that will help decrease behavior, that decreases the future frequency of behavior, whereas reinforcement results in an increase in the future frequency of behavior. So I think that should be one of the biggest ways that you should be looking to distinguish between those different procedures. Now let's talk about identifying the context of negative reinforcement. And this is referring to making sure that you are able to identify what the establishing operation is in a negative reinforcement contingency. And this can be very difficult to identify in situations in which the aversive stimulus is not very clear or apparent. So there will be situations when a client engages in prolonged behavior or an escape maintained behavior, and it's not apparent what that aversive stimulus was in the first place. Like, what was the establishing operation that evoked this particular behavior? And so it's very important that you are collecting data consistently of the different contingencies that are at play, so that you're able to identify what that particular establishing operation is, what the aversive stimulus is that may be contributing to the behavior. Once you're able to identify the aversive stimulus that the client is trying to escape or avoid, then you're able to determine an intervention that might be effective for reducing that particular behavior. But until you aren't sure what the contingency maintaining that behavior is, you might misidentify the function of the behavior and might not realize that it's an escape maintained behavior. So let's continue talking about what you can do when you have a behavior that's maintained by negative reinforcement. Okay, I gave you guys the example of, a child that engages in aggression in order to, let's say, escape or avoid a particular aversive stimulus, well, I said that you can teach them appropriate replacement behaviors, such as communicating that they want to stop some engagement with a peer, or maybe that they need help from the teacher, or there's different things that you can teach them to say. You could teach them to request a break, that, you know, they want to be all done, they want to leave the area, they don't want to be present, right? All of these different forms of communication are considered functional communication responses, and they are appropriate replacement behaviors meant to replace those maladaptive behaviors. So the idea is that if we can give this appropriate alternative behavior and, you know, help this person acquire this response, we can reinforce that response very heavily. The idea is that there's not going to be a need anymore for them to engage in the other behavior. Additionally, we would place the other behavior on extinction, so we wouldn't provide reinforcement for that other, you know, maladaptive behavior, let's say aggression. Instead, we would reinforce only this appropriate alternative replacement behavior or behaviors that we're teaching in their place. So this is a procedure called functional communication training. Again, we're teaching we have a maladaptive behavior that we're placing on extinction, and then we have our appropriate replacement responses, communication responses that we're teaching that serve the same function. And then we would reinforce those with very high magnitude, very consistently. And usually what happens is we'll see a reduction in the maladaptive behavior, and then we'll see an increase in these replacement behaviors as long as they're being taught appropriately. Additionally, you can provide non-contingent reinforcement to behaviors that are negatively reinforced. Okay, non-contingent reinforcement is a procedure that you haven't heard me talk about yet, or maybe you've heard me touch on it in a few lectures, but maybe you haven't heard me thoroughly talk about it. But non-contingent reinforcement is a time-based schedule in which we provide reinforcement independent of behavior, right? We don't care about what behavior is happening at the time that we're delivering reinforcement. We just deliver reinforcement on a time-based schedule. So it could be on, let's say every 2 minutes, I'm going to deliver reinforcement regardless of what that person is doing. That's why I say independent of behavior. It just means that regardless of what the person is doing, I'm going to provide reinforcement. So if we were using non-contingent reinforcement for behaviors that are negatively reinforced, what this would look like would be, let's say, providing escape every 2 minutes, right? So let's say you have a client that engages in aggression to get out of completing tasks, then we could provide breaks every 2 minutes, right? So that there's a diminished EO for engaging in aggression. There's no need to engage in escape maintained behaviors because we are providing escape non-contingently, meaning non-contingent on behavior, independent of behavior. We are providing that need. We're satisfying that need, which is to receive a break from, let's say, a difficult demand, okay? So with non-contingent reinforcement for negatively reinforced behaviors, all we're going to do is we're going to try to satisfy that specific establishing operation or satiate that establishing operation. Okay, so if they need breaks, we're going to provide very frequent breaks throughout the day so that they don't have to engage in any escape maintained behaviors. Okay, so when you're trying to target behaviors that are negatively reinforcing for the client, there's some more things that we can do. So for example, we can modify antecedents to make it less likely that a situation is aversive. Okay, so we can basically reduce the aversiveness of a situation in order to decrease those behaviors that are maintained by escape. So for example, we can reduce the difficulty of tasks prior to a task being presented. An example of this would be, let's say that you have a client that engages in problem behavior because you're giving them, a chore to do that's too difficult. Let's say that you've given them an entire laundry basket of clothes, and you're asking them to sort the clothes by color so that they can do their laundry. So they have to have a pile for colored clothes, and then they have to have a pile for whites. Maybe if they're engaging in escape maintained behaviors during that task, maybe the task could be simplified so that it's less difficult for that client. So let's say that instead of giving them an entire hamper of laundry clothes, you might give them only 4 pieces. Okay, so that they can sort. You're basically going to reduce the difficulty of that demand to make it less aversive for the client. So then what you're doing is since it's less aversive, there's not really a need for them to engage in problem behavior. The next thing we could do is provide choices among different tasks. So let's say that I just gave an example of a chore. Well, if you're going to have a client engage in different chores, you can give them choices among the different tasks that are available. So for example, if they have to do the laundry, throw out the trash, and do laundry, throw out the trash, and clean the bathroom, you could say, these are the 3 things that we have to do today. Which of these would you like to do? And then we could also say, well, which of these would you like to do first? So we can also allow them to choose the order of tasks to create some more predictability in their schedule, or some more routines, basically where they can anticipate what's coming next and it becomes less aversive for them. So these are just some antecedent manipulations basically that we can implement in order to reduce the aversiveness of a specific situation, which in turn will help us to reduce the behavior that is maintained by escape. That's usually maladaptive behavior that we're trying to target for reduction. So far, the interventions that we've talked about in terms of reducing behavior that are maintained by negative reinforcement have been using non-contingent reinforcement to try to decrease the establishing operation for engaging in escape maintained behaviors. Okay, so where we provide escape non-contingently. We've also talked about functional communication training, where we try to teach an appropriate communicative response that serves as an alternative replacement behavior. And then we also place the problem behavior on extinction. And then in the last slide, I talked to you guys about different antecedent manipulations that you can implement to reduce the aversiveness and in change also reduce the likelihood of the behavior maintained by escape. Now, there's another intervention that I want to talk to you about, but it also comes with ethical considerations. So this intervention actually used to be taught pretty heavily in the field, and I would say implemented pretty consistently in the field for escape maintained behaviors. This is an intervention that you've all heard me talk about, or you've all heard in previous courses at least. It's called extinction. So extinction is, as you know, the withholding of reinforcement. And by withholding reinforcement for a behavior that used to be reinforced, we are able to reduce that behavior to 0. When we apply extinction to behaviors that are maintained by negative reinforcement, we are withholding escape, basically. So this specific intervention is actually called escape extinction. When we are applying extinction to behaviors that are maintained by negative reinforcement, we are implementing a procedure called escape extinction. Escape extinction is a very effective procedure for behaviors that are maintained by negative reinforcement. Incredibly effective. An example of this would be if you have a client that engages in aggression to get out of completing a task, we can implement escape extinction whereby they no longer are able to escape the task by engaging in aggression. So now, if you have a client that is engaging in aggression and if you have a client that has a task that's very difficult, let's say they engage in aggression in order to escape the task, well, now that you're implementing escape extinction, we won't allow them to escape simply because they're engaging in aggression. Or if you have a client that throws pencils because a task is very difficult, you can have an entire pack of pencils, so that now just because they threw one pencil doesn't mean that they're going to escape the task. But rather, you have tons of pencils to continue to give them their pencils, and they have to continue to complete the task. So they can't escape the task as easily. Escape extinction is, like I said, a very effective intervention. However, it has certain considerations that you should keep in mind. Extinction is a procedure that will produce a lot of emotional reactions from clients, or it can produce a lot of emotional reactions from clients. And it is more restrictive than those other procedures that we talked about previously. So functional communication training involves an extinction component, right, where we're no longer delivering reinforcement or allowing escape for the problem behavior, but it also incorporates an appropriate alternative replacement behavior that's being taught and is being reinforced. So functional communication training is a less restrictive intervention than escape extinction. Antecedent manipulations are much less restrictive interventions than escape extinction. What was the other one? Non-contingent reinforcement, again, also a less restrictive intervention than escape extinction. So although escape extinction is incredibly effective, and we can still use this intervention, right? There will be a time and a place for using this intervention, and there will be a need for it at some point. With some of our clients, there are less restrictive interventions that are just as likely to be effective, that we should try first. But like I said, there will be some situations that will call for escape extinction to be used, but it should not be the only intervention that you ever use for escape maintained behaviors. And I want to emphasize this point, because when I first started in this field, I remember people used to think about the functions of behavior and then their interventions as like a mathematical equation. So they used to hear, there's this behavior maintained by escape. The intervention that I must use is escape extinction. And they would never think about any other interventions that could be used. And so I just want to emphasize, escape extinction is not the only intervention that you can use to manage behaviors that are negatively reinforced or that are maintained by escape. Escape extinction is one of many possible interventions and is one of many effective interventions. Okay, and it's also one of the more restrictive, I would say, interventions for managing behavior maintained by escape. So if you want to implement escape extinction, if you want to implement an intervention for a behavior maintained by negative reinforcement, you can consider escape extinction, but it's also important that you consider the effects of escape extinction on your client, and also that you consider, are there other interventions that are less restrictive and likely to obtain the same result? So just, some food for thought. I'm mentioning this and I'm spending a lot of time talking about this because, as I've mentioned in the past, there is that whole anti-ABA movement. And part of the anti-ABA movement, they always talk about ABA being traumatic, and that ABA was very restrictive. I think escape extinction can be one of those interventions that we have to be cautious with, and we have to consider other less restrictive options if there are less restrictive options that are likely to be just as effective. So just some food for thought. If you can carry out an intervention that wouldn't produce severe emotional reactions for your clients and would obtain the same result, then you should go for those first. And if those don't work and you've ruled those out, they're ineffective, then there might be a reason to use escape extinction. But whenever possible, try to teach replacement behaviors. Go for less restrictive interventions. Be considerate of your clients and their needs. Okay, we're going to keep talking about ethical considerations in this slide, but this slide focuses on the use of negative reinforcement to teach behaviors, whereas the last few slides I've been talking about trying to reduce behaviors that are maintained by negative reinforcement. So if you recall, I talked to you guys in a previous slide about behaviors that can be acquired through negative reinforcement can be adaptive or maladaptive. In this particular slide, I'm focusing on those skills that we can teach through negative reinforcement. So for example, we can teach communication skills such as stop, I don't like that, I need more time. We could teach a person to wait appropriately through the use of negative reinforcement. There are different skills that we can teach through negative reinforcement. And we will continue to teach certain skills through the use of negative reinforcement. But whenever possible, we should try to emphasize the use of positive reinforcement over negative reinforcement, because when we are using negative reinforcement, we are exposing our clients to aversive events. And if you're doing this very often, that's going to pair you as an aversive. You might, be making your client miserable. They might not be having a good time in sessions just because you're exposing them continually to situations that they don't want to be exposed to, or particular stimuli that are aversive to them. Okay. Also, sometimes the exposure to certain aversive stimuli is not justified at all to teach a skill, because it can be dangerous to that person, to your client, or to other people around them. So for example, if you have a child that engages in aggression towards other people in order to escape particular stimuli, and then you're expecting to continue to expose them, their peers, let's say, you're expecting to continue, you want to teach them a skill and you're expecting to continue to expose them to that stimulus. What do you think is going to happen? They're going to hit their peers, right? So you're putting that client and their peers in a dangerous situation that you don't want to be exposing them to. So there are going to be certain situations where it's completely unacceptable to teach a behavior through the use of negative reinforcement, because you could be exposing people to dangerous aversive events.